Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello, my name is Uswatun Hasanah. I'm from TBI1 and my ID number T2019 60 and 15. Now I want to explain about introducing translation. The first is word for word or sense for sense. Up until the second half of the 20th century, Western translation theory seemed to look in what George Steiner calls a serious debate over the threat of literal, free, and faithful translation. The distinction between word for word, uh, example is literal, and sense for sense, exactly is free translation goes back to Cicero and Sergio. Cicero outlined his approach to translation that the interpreter means the literal word-for-word translator, while the orator tried to produce a speech that moved the listener. Although some scholars, example is Lambert, argue that this term have been misinterpreted, Jerome's statement is now usually taken to refer to what come to be known as literal word-for-word and free sense-for-sense translation. Cheom rejected the word for word approach because by following so closely the form of the ST, it produced an absurd translation, cloaking the sense of the original. The sense for sense approach, on the other hand, allowed the sense or content of the ST to be translated. In this policy can be seen the origin of both the literal versus free and form versus content debate that has continued until modern times. The next is translation theory. The first theory is John Dryden. John Dryden, 1631 until 1700, whose brief description of the translation process would have enormous impact of subsequent translation theory and practice. And John Dryden, who was an English poet and translator, reduced our translation to three categories. The first is metaphrase. Metaphrase is word by word and line by line translation from one language into another, which corresponding to literal translation. The mean is form, and the second is paraphrase. Paraphrase is sense for sense translation with latitude where the message of the author is kept but his words are not so strictly followed as his sense, which too can be altered or amplified. The main is content, and the third is imitation. Imitation is forsaking both word and sense. This corresponding to Cowley's very free translation and is more or less adaptation. Imitation is the use of the either metaphrase or paraphrase, but the translator has the liberty to choose what is appropriate and how the message will be conveyed. The next is other early writers on translation also began to state their principle in a similarly perspective fashion. One of the first had been Etienne Dolet. Etienne Dolet set out five principles in order the important as follows. The first is the translator must perfectly understand the sense and material of the original author, and the second is the translator should have a perfect knowledge of both source language and target language, so as not to lessen the majesty to the language of the language. And the third is the translator should avoid word for word renderings, and the fourth is the translator should avoid Latinate and unusual form, and the fifth is the translator should assemble and realize the word eloquently to avoid clumsiness. The next is Titland. Titland has three general laws or rules. The first is the translation should give a complete transcript of the ideas of the original work. And the second is the style and manner of writing should be of the same character with that of the original. And the third is the translation should have all the ease of the original composition. Taylor's first law ties in with Dolet's first two principles. in that it refers to the translator having a perfect knowledge of the original, being competent in the subject, and giving a faithful transfusion of the sensor and meaning of the author. Title's second law, like Title's five principle, deals with the style of the author and having the ability and characters to recreate it in the target language. The third law talks of having all the ease of the composition of the ST. Theater regards this as the most difficult task and likes it in a traditional metaphor to an artist producing a copy of painting. And the next is toward contemporary translation theory. The dichotomy was the central weakness of the theory of translation because it is assumed to have analyzable meaning in comparison with the undefined alternatives such as letter or spirit, word or sense. Other modern theoreticians conclude that the main problem with the writing on translation in this period was that the criteria for judgment were vague and subjective, and the judgments themselves were highly normative. As a reaction against such a vagueness and contradiction, translation theory in the second half of the 20th century made various attempts to redefine the concept literal and free in operational terms, to describe meaning in scientific terms, and to put together systematic taxonomy of translation phenomena. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello, my name is Uswatun Hasanah. I'm from TBI1 and my ID number T2019 60 and 15. Now I want to explain about introducing translation. The first is word for word or sense for sense. Up until the second half of the 20th century, Western translation theory seemed to look in what Short Steiner calls a serious debate over the threat of literal, free, and faithful translation. The distinction between word for word, uh, example is literal, and sense for sense, exactly is free translation goes back to Cicero and Sergio. Cicero outlined his approach to translation that the interpreter means the literal word-for-word translator, while the orator tried to produce a speech that moved the listener. There are two case studies. The first case study is assessment criteria. The area of assessment criteria is one where a more expert writer addresses a less expert reader. The criteria for assessing the translation are given accuracy. Accuracy is the correct transfer of information and evidence of complete comprehension. And the second is the appropriate choice of vocabulary, idiom, terminology, and register. And the third is cohesion, coherent, and organization. And the fourth is accuracy in technical aspect of punctuation. The second case study is the translated preface. Translated prefaces are a source of extensive information on the translation approach adopted in earlier centuries. The concept of loyalty to the author and being faithful to the meaning could almost have come straight from the writing of the 17th century. The division between meaning and tone of words could also be taken to originate in the debate on form versus content. The use of general terms such as tone in the commentary also echoes the imprecision of early writing. So, chapter 2, you got a bit further back. Yes, I do. I start with Cicero and Sergio, who are the huge figures in early translation theory. They were translators themselves, and they wrote about the translation process as some of the early theories did. And I look at the concept of literal and free translation, which many ways originated with that writing. So the Ed's theorem, for example, would say he was translating sensor for sensor rather than word for word, and it dominated much of Western translation theory, certainly for 1500 um, 2,000 years, so I try and bring out it all really obviously a very quick run through of some of the key figures, but I try and bring out of this concept remain of relevance to the translation theory, but then the reason I do that is because the rest of the book then moves forward, and even some of the later theories in people like Trident and Hitler begin to look in a more sophisticated way when you need more nuanced way. Some of the other factor whichever translation is, it's not just literal and free. The writing on translation becomes much more sophisticated later on, and of course religion played a big role in terms of characterizing translation who claim, and in many different contexts as well. In Europe it was a translation of the Bible above all, and there were figures such as Martin Luther or William Tyndale who were translating the Bible into the local um, language, whether it be German or English, and who run real risks in that way. These are classical example of how translation mix with ideology and power, and so the very act of translation was an act of challenging the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, and so the Hook figured some of whom fight with their lives for. Another thing is really interesting is what happened in other tradition. So I speak a little bit about the tradition of translating but Buddhist sutras into Chinese, and this word were very big collaborative project and of interest also because they were translating from an oral version of the text normally in Sanskrit into Chinese, and so we can see a little bit how the translation process varied over the course of the centuries as these texts were translated into Chinese for a new audience, and they become established in that way as well. Okay, I think enough for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.